Welcome to Client-Side Web Scripting. We're going to start off our semester by doing a short review of some JavaScript concepts that you covered in Introduction to Programming. Since it may be a little while since you took Introduction to Programming, I mean, even if you took it last semester, you've been off for about a month to 6 weeks. So I want to get that gray matter going again and think about what JavaScript concepts are going to apply and kind of make sure we all start off with the same foundation as we're going further ahead in our JavaScript journey through client-side web scripting. Further, you may have taken the Introduction to Programming prerequisite course like last spring or last fall or a year or so ago. So it may have been a while since you looked at JavaScript. So I just want to cover some high-level things to again spark the memory a little bit about some of the JavaScript concepts before we dive into some more complex stuff. That way we don't get caught up in some of the foundational concepts that were covered in Introduction to Programming. So first of all, I want to cover what are some things that we can cover as far as making sure that we have resources necessary to if we have questions or so on and so forth. There are tons of resources and tools out there on JavaScript. It's one of the more popular languages that are out there. So obviously Google is our friend. So we can use Google to search just about anything we want. There's stackoverflow.com, things like that we can use. But there's some other tools. Now there's more. This is not an all-encompassing list. I'm just throwing out some tools that I have used quite often in the past or come across and found them helpful. You may find some different ones. There's no shortage of resources or tools when it comes to JavaScript. So let me just show you just a couple of these. First of all, JS Hint. Let me bring that on the screen. Let me make it just a bit bigger here so it's easier to see. JS Hint is a linting, like there's JS Lint. There's a bunch of linting, hinting services out there. There's ones for HTML, there's ones for CSS, there's ones for JavaScript. And for those of you that come from a C# classical object-oriented language, there's their own versions of linters and hinters. Like in C# Visual Studio, they have style cop. Basically what these make sure that you do is have proper coding technique, make sure that you don't have errors or things that could be prone to errors, like instantiated, non-instantiated variables, things like that. So I actually have this tool built into my IDE, my editor, so I can access JS Hint from within my editor rather than going to the website. But there's nothing stopping you from going to the website to do this. So if you have some piece of JavaScript code, all you got to do is copy and paste it here where I highlighted, and on the right hand side it'll tell you information that's out there. So for example, let's say I miss a parentheses. See, if I take off the right parenthesis, then you can see I have a bunch of warnings out here that I have issues with, and so I can fix my parenthesis, put it back, and there it goes back to the way it was. Or maybe I misspell function. See, it tells me that I've got an undefined variable function and missing the C. Or if I forget a semicolon, I'm missing a semicolon. So it helps make sure that you're a better coder. So I use JS Hint all the time. Another one they have is Jsfiddle. Let me get rid of JS Hint. Jsfiddle is a pretty cool one. You'll run across Jsfiddle quite a bit if you go to a lot of the forums like Stack Overflow. This is used a lot of times to work out things. It's kind of like a scratch pad sort of thing, but you can save your code pieces and share them on forums and things. So if you look here, you can, it's free to sign up. It doesn't cost anything, but you can create your own, what's called a fiddle. And you can title it, put in a description, that sort of thing on the left-hand side. You can see if you want to have any external resources, such as some, if you're going to have any JavaScript libraries, things like that. But then what you do is you type in your HTML here in this box. See, it says HTML right there. You type in your JavaScript in the box underneath it. You type your CSS, if any, on the upper right-hand side. And then when you click the Run button right here on the left-hand side, upper left-hand corner, it'll actually show you the result in the lower right-hand corner. So if you're working on some code, sometimes it's helpful if you're building an application that's rather robust and you got a lot of lines of code, but you're only working on a specific piece. If you want to just pull that relevant code, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript out of your code base, you can plunk it into here and mess with it, and you don't have to worry about messing with your initial code base, your original code base, and you can play with it and try some things out, do what if scenarios, that type of thing on here. I've used this quite a bit. It's pretty handy. Another one, W3 Schools, is a pretty cool site. It's been around for a while. This is basically a teaching site where it'll give you an overview of a lot of technologies that web developers deal with. There's tons of information here. You know, you can learn if you haven't done any HTML before, which if you're in this class you've done at least Web 1 probably. You can learn HTML, you can learn some CSS, there's some frameworks like Bootstrap, here's some JavaScript stuff you can learn, some stuff by HTML graphics, some server-side stuff. So there's a bunch of things that you can learn on this site. So if I want to click Learn JavaScript, I come here, and here is on the left-hand side is my tutorial. It goes through all of the different JavaScript stuff that's available. And then what is really cool about this site is they've got a try it yourself button, as you can see on a lot of their code examples. So here I've got my first JavaScript, click me to display date and time. I can click try it yourself. It opens up a new window, and very similar to Jsfiddle, although not as detailed as Jsfiddle gets as far as breaking things down. Over on the left hand side is my code, and so I can type in here different pieces of code, click see the result, it shows up over here, and then I can try it. So it gives me like a little scratch pad that I can do some things with. Now there are also other services out there like Code Academy, Code Avengers, Code.org, Code School. I mean, these are not the end all be all of all of them. There's tons of them out there. There's some of them are free, or some of them are paid. Some of them have partially free, and others the rest of it paid. So it all depends on what you're looking for, what you like. If you're in this class, you've done Code Avengers in Web 1 and Introduction to Programming. So these are just resources to help you to become a better developer. So the other thing is browsers. Obviously JavaScript, even though it's not confined necessarily to a browser only, if you take some of our other classes like Web Programming 2, for example, you will learn how JavaScript is everywhere. You do JavaScript in the mobile world, so if you take any of our mobile classes, so it's not just confined to a browser, but you can do it in a mobile environment. You can do JavaScript on the server side, outside the browser, within a command line interface. There's a bunch of ways where JavaScript has matured over the years and broken out of its browser shell. However, that being said, inside a browser is where the majority of JavaScript programming takes place. So you're going to need a modern browser to do all that. Now I recommend either Chrome or Firefox. My personal preference at this point in time is Chrome. That can always change as browsers are updated, things change. I used to be my favorite was Firefox, but Chrome has outpaced it as far as what its user interface and usability is. Doesn't mean I don't ever use Firefox, but I have preferred Chrome over the last year and a half, 2 years. One of the most difficult ones to work with will be Internet Explorer. You're going to have to work with it at some point just because of the amount of user base, even though it's not near what it was before. A lot of people use Chrome and Firefox nowadays. It still has a higher usage. Now, the pain traditionally with Internet Explorer was it was clunky to work with from a developer standpoint. It played by its own rules. But over the years, because of competition from Chrome, Firefox, and developers just wanting to do things the right way, Internet Explorer is probably the best it's ever been in the latest release of the Edge. It's not 100% there, but it's pretty close. Now there's also Safari in the Mac world that's pretty good to work with. It's the main Mac browser, obviously. I don't think it's as smooth as Chrome or Firefox to work with, but it still has a lot of the good tools in it to work with. So you're going to need a browser to run some things in. And I'm going to go through some examples, and I'm going to use Chrome in my examples. Doesn't mean you can't use Firefox. But one of the things within a browser that you're going to use is the inspection tool. Now, all the modern browsers come with built-in inspection tools. Chrome and Firefox are probably the more mature ones, and the best ones, with closely followed by Safari. Now, there is another one out there some of you may have heard of called Opera, but it's not used by a lot of users. So I even though it's not a bad browser by any means, but I tend to not use it because if most people don't use it, why would I try to develop for it? So, but Chrome and Firefox are probably the best inspection tools out there. Followed closely by Safari. IE brings up a distant third. They have inspection tools, but they're kind of clunky. They're not as easy to use as Chrome and Firefox. Now, there's also some additional add-ons you can get. You can get Firebug, which is an inspection tool you can add into Firefox. There's also a web developer toolbar that you can add into Firefox, things like that. But basically, let me just show you an example here. In my editor, I have just a simple HTML page, and I have this document right. This is my text, okay, that's going to show up. So if I bring that over here, this is my text, this is the page I'm looking at. Let me just refresh it, make sure I'm working with the latest. And then down here is my inspector tool. So now you may not have this. This is an add-on. I have this WASP tool, so that's okay if you don't have that. Don't freak out about that. But probably the primary ones you're going to use is Elements, which you're going to see all your markup, your console, which is where you're going to see any error messages and things like that. Once we go further along in this semester, you're going to use network, because we're going to be communicating from the client side to a server side and back, and we're going to use this tab to take a look at that communication as it goes back and forth. Those are the main ones you're going to use. Not to say the other ones aren't important, but those are probably the main ones that you are going to use. Now, additionally, editors. You're going to see me use brackets a lot. It's my current editor of choice. Doesn't mean it's the same for everybody. You might have one you prefer, like Sublime Text, which is another good editor that's primarily used on the Mac, but doesn't mean it's solely, but it seems to have a higher Mac following. You can use Visual Studio, you can use Dreamweaver, you can use Notepad++. I wouldn't recommend it because it doesn't have the helps that the others do, but you can use tons of editors. You could use Notepad. I wouldn't recommend it. You go cross-eyed, but looking at all the same colored text. But you're going to see me use brackets. You can feel free to use whatever you want, but I use brackets quite a bit, and there's some add-ons and stuff. It's open source, so those of you that recall, you may have already used it in Introduction to Programming. So now the other thing is make sure you keep in mind reserved words. Here's a list of reserved words. You don't want to use these in your code because they mean something in your code. So if I have a variable that I call false, I'm going to run into issues with that. So make sure you stay away from these reserved words. Any words that are used in your programming you want to stay away from using as function names, variable names, things like that. And then data types. Remember, there's different data types we're going to work with. There's both primitive and complex. On every program you work with primitive, text and number and Boolean data types, but on the majority of programs you work with complex arrays and objects, undefined and null. We're going to work a lot with objects and arrays, but what you'll find is that sometimes primitive data types are encompassed within complex data types. So we might have an object that also has inside of that object is an array. Inside of that array are texts, strings, integers, booleans. So any combination of nested complex objects, arrays, and with primitive data types kind of commingled in there. So we're going to work with a lot of that, but just keep that in mind as we're working with different data types. So just to refresh our memory a little bit, let me just close that one. We've got our text data types. Let me unquote that. So here we have our variable we can alert out, and we're just reassigning data, and we should get 3 different responses here. Let me refresh. I am the first, I am the second, now I have a third. So just different assigning of text is pretty easy to do in JavaScript. And then we have our numbers. There's a whole bunch of different ways we can write numbers within JavaScript. You can write it with decimals, you can write it without decimals. I'll show you how these alert differently since we have basically nothing behind that decimal point. It's pretty interesting. We can use scientific exponential notation and even negative exponential notation. So if I refresh this, you have 12. Notice there's no decimal 00 after it. 12 again. 1, 2, 3, and then all zeros, and then in decimal form. And then Boolean, let me comment that out, uncomment this. Again, just simple true, false. And a lot of these we'll use in comparisons and if statements and things, true and false, so that we can do some if comparisons and make conditional statements based on where we want to go in our control flow statements of our program. And then we have our arrays, our complex data types. So in this particular example, we have our first long line 46 here, our variable cars, which we say is a new array. We start off as being empty, and then we assign to the first position member arrays are 0 base, second position, and third position the Chevy, Ford, Dodge, just some strings there. And then if we alert out just the array cars, we should get all 3 of them. And then here, if we alert out cars bracket 1, we should just get Ford here. Now let me actually comment out the second part so we can see this. So there I get Chevy, Ford, Dodge, and then I just get Ford for that second alert. Now, if we go back here and we look at this next one, we have a variable with makes. This is the same new keyword and array method call to create an array here, but here, instead of just creating an empty array, notice we are filling in the 0, 1, and 2 key positions within our array right on the fly. And I can do the same thing with makes here as my variable and calling it. So here we got Chevy, Ford, Dodge, Ford, Nissan, Mazda, Toyota, and then undefined. Now, why is this undefined? Well, the reason, remember, 0 based. Here, if I'm alerting out 3, Nissan is 0, Mazda is 1, Toyota is 2, so there is no third position. That's why it came out as undefined. And then lastly here we have, or next to last I should say, we have our object data types. This you will work with a ton because they are a favorite among JavaScript programmers because of their ease with which you can work with them. So here, the way you know it's an object, just like an array, you know it by brackets, an object you know by these curly braces. So here I have this variable person, and this person has 3 properties: a first name property, a last name property, and an ID property. And those properties have values. So all objects have name value property pairs. So you have your property of first name, your value of John, your property of last name, your value of Doe, your ID property and value of 5566. It's in here that you can see I have a string and 2 strings and an integer, but there's nothing stopping me from having a an array value as a property. You're even going to see later on in the semester we're going to do function values in properties, so we can put functions within our properties and things like that to make more complex objects. So we can do a bunch of things within objects. You're going to work with objects a ton. So now when I alert out person, let me comment out these here and show you what happens here when I alert out person. Let me make my screen a little smaller. So see, now what it's saying is object there in brackets. Notice I didn't get the values here, first name, last name, ID. It's alerting out and saying, hey, this is a complex object that you just tried to alert. So how do we get to that information? Well, there's 2 ways. One is bracket notation and one is .object notation. You'll find that .object notation is used more often, and it's actually one that I prefer because it's a little easier. It's less typing than doing the bracket notation. Nothing wrong with doing bracket notation, but .object is a little faster and a little easier and a little more simplified to understand. You wouldn't it's less likely to confuse array notation with .object notation. So as you can see here, I have a variable name, and I made that equal to person dot last name. So what this dot does is first it goes, okay, I've got a variable named person right here, and then the dot goes in 1 level and looks for a property called last name. So in this case, the value of that is Doe. So Doe should be equal to name. So when I alert out name here, it should be Doe. So let me comment that out. And let me refresh. object, object, and then do. Now here, the similar, I just use bracket notation here, going in and finding the property of first name. I alerted out, it should alert out John. So let me refresh. Object, object, do, and then John. So see, there's a bunch of different ways you can access it, and it's pretty powerful once you start getting into what you can do with complex objects. Now, just a quick issue here, just to show you. We have here nulls. If I do, here I have truck and Tonka truck and just some strings. But if I take one, and let me just alert those out real quick so you can see they're just simply strings that are going to alert out I am a truck, I'm a Tonka truck. But I just want to show you the difference here. If I take this and put it with just the quotes, nothing in them, and I take this one and I remove that whole right side of that equation, let's see what happens here. See, we have nothing alerted, that's truck that has been alerted out. And this one is undefined. So see, there's a big difference in the first one's null, there's nothing in it. The second one is undefined, it has not been instantiated with any value whatsoever. So it exists, but it's undefined. So just some points of clarification. Make sure that when you create your variables, try to instantiate them with a value as soon as possible. Now there's, usually I do it right when I create them. But there are going to be times when you can't do that, when it doesn't work. So that's okay. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just you need to make sure when you're coding that you're testing for nulls for basically nothing, and you're testing for undefineds. So if you get an undefined error, it is truly undefined.